There is rural, there is remote, and then there are the West Virginia hollers. Far removed from civilization, these hollers are astonishingly home to a thriving tourist railroad, the Durbin and Greenbrier Valleys, West Virginia Central. Based out of Elkins, the WVC has occupied my bucket list's top tier for years, and I was over the moon to finally be exploring the operation. It all came to fruition on Sunday, August 3rd, 2025. I giddily started the day in Belington, West Virginia, where the railroad keeps a small yard chocked full of unique equipment. To fully appreciate what exists in Belington and the WVC as a whole, we must first understand the mountainous region's history. Squeezed into the Allegheny Mountains above the Monongahela National Forest, most of the WVC's network traces roots back to the famous Western Maryland, with neighboring roads hailing from the Baltimore and Ohio, Beech Mountain, Chesapeake and Ohio, and Elk River. As coal dried up and lines were mothballed, the state stepped in, owning some of the only active branch lines left, with the WVC as their chosen operator. Outlasting most of its neighboring railroads, the West Virginia Central is the final resting place for local fallen flags, with Belington providing a kaleidoscope of color on some truly rare locomotives. Front and center is an original Baltimore and Ohio E8 whose US DOT livery is barely identifiable as the result of 2 motionless decades here in Belington. The E8 shields an even more derelict locomotive, West Virginia Northern Consolidation number 19. It's anybody's guess as to when she last ran. Visible from the same spot is a nearly cannibalized Alco FA, a Baldwin VO1000 lettered for the Middle Fork Railroad, and 3 of the Elk River Railroad's 5 locomotives. The Elk River is a recent casualty in the area, relying on coal and then later car storage and repairs for the latter 2 decades of its existence. Finally throwing in the towel in 2022, the blue EMDs quietly moved to the WVC shortly thereafter. Elk River's demise foreshadowed that of the nearby Beech Mountain Railroads, a 10-mile coal hauler that served a single mine. Every facet of Beech Mountain, from mine to interchange, was owned by Ukrainian mineral company Carter Roag, whose overseas customers could no longer afford Beech Mountain's highly bituminous coal following the Russian invasion. As with the Elk River, Middle Fork, West Virginia Northern, and B&O before it, all 3 of Carter Roag's locomotives wound up in Belington. Alcos number 113 and 116 have accepted their fate on the south side of the yard, while SW7 number 114 is kept company by 2 other dinosaurs, C&O F7 number 7094 and Western Maryland BL2 number 82. One of 2 BL2s owned by the WM, it was the first I'd seen of the prototype, and probably the last, as EMD only ever made 59. As for the F7, it's only a few years removed from service, built in 1950 for the Milwaukee Road and purchased by the DGVR in 2008. After only a few minutes in Belington, I was floored by the exposure I'd had to all these fallen flags. I wasn't even halfway through the yard's vibrant inventory, with the south side providing even more stupendous goodies. The Carter Roag engines must signify an Alco deadline, as they're joined by VGNX number 615 in FA2, originally built for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. Curiously painted in sepia colors, the engine is stored under private ownership here in Belington, as is the black, unmarked Alco to its north. Moving south along the outside tracks from the BL2 are 3 interesting EMDs bracketing an unknown center cab, as they're all slowly enveloped by nature. Locomotives number 6530 and 6641 are off the B&O, while the green and yellow engine comes from the Chesapeake and Ohio. How the C&O engine wound up in bright green and yellow is beyond me, and I was beginning to realize that Belington created more questions than answers. Also of note is another Elk River locomotive, whose bright blue colors shone through the trees on the tracks closest to me, while numerous unidentifiable wheel sets occupied the remainder. The fifth and final Elk River engine is now unrecognizable, painted in Western Maryland's red, white, and black circus scheme for use on the WVC's passenger runs. Unpowered and used as a cab control unit, Engine 24 is paired with F7B number 415 and called into service when the railroad's 2 operational F units go down for maintenance. At this point, I'd only been trackside for half an hour and already seen 20 different locomotives representing 8 fallen flags. The variety was incredible, and I hadn't even seen a moving train. By 7 a.m., I was south of town alongside the Belington walking trail, waiting in anticipation for the day's excursion. My patience paid off just before 8, as Western Maryland F7's number 243 and 67 brought the consist south for Elkins. As paying customers board in Elkins, this requires a deadhead move from the Belington shops prior to each day of operations. Marketed as the new Tygart Flyer, this train runs from April through November, departing Elkins for the high falls of Cheat River. Between the Deadhead and Revenue Run, I figured I'd have a pretty comprehensive morning along the WVC, traveling nearly the length of accessible railroad from Belington to Bemis. The tracks extend north of Belington for Tygart Junction, while they are inactive between High Falls and the northern endpoint of sister railroad Cass Scenic. Also owned by the D&GV, Cass is world famous for its roster of geared steam locomotives, but the Western Maryland widebodies cannot be overlooked. I can't believe the legendary black and gold speed lettering still graces an operational set of F units as I pinched myself outside of Junior with the sun gleaming down on the train and I. Most of the route between Belington and Elkins closely follows the Tygart River as the two carve a path through the West Virginian Alleghenies. I found river and rail again near Norton, watching from a secluded break in the trees as some local waterfowl enjoyed Mother Nature's lazy river. This is, I think, the only time when power lines have come in handy for railfanning. Continuing from Norton, we now get a glimpse into the West Virginia Central's freight business. Most of the traffic is made up of mineral products for JF Aggregates, a large employer in the area that ships in construction material for use throughout neighboring states. JF is joined by a scrap dealer in Elkins as the WVC's 2 freight customers, receiving weekly service from the railroad, usually on Mondays. Freight trains on the WVC were once powered by the Elk River and B&O locomotives, but today only the Western Maryland engines remain roadworthy. Bulldogs number 243 and 67 were a big catalyst for my visit. The Western Maryland speed lettering needs no introduction, and finding it on F units along this rarely documented railroad was just too good a scenario. I was trackside next in Elkins as the deadhead veers off the main line, running along a short spur that allows access to the station. This spur was once Western Maryland's main line into the Mountain State, coming out of Cumberland in order to access the region's booming coal seams. 50 years sure makes a difference, as the line is cut at the station behind me and only ever sees the new Tygart flyer. Just after 9 a.m. and an hour from Belington, the train and I were to lay over in Elkins until the scheduled 11 a.m. departure. During the layover, I had planned to double back to Belington for some drone shots of the old locomotives, but I just couldn't tear myself away from the F7's. 4 feet longer than their F7 cousins, the P denotes a steam generator used to provide head-end power for passenger trains. Built in 1952, our leader today is WVC number 243, serving numerous Canadian commuter agencies, the Canadian Pacific, and then eventually WVC. Trailing engine number 67 was the Clinchfield's only FP7, although with its steam generator torn out, it is technically a standard F7. Both engines were thoughtfully painted into their current colors by WVC, who took extra care when numbering them as well, putting them in sequential order according to Western Maryland's roster. WM, FP7's, and F7's were numbered up to 242 and 66 respectively, hence the WVC's 243 and 67. This was a very cool Easter egg. Chasing the new Tygart flyer from Belington is possible because of Elkins town leadership, who prefers the train live in Belington rather than the downtown station. The Mountain State's 25th most populated city, Elkins hosts nearly quadruple its citizenship in yearly railroad passengers. Fall is the busiest season, with multiple weekly runs sold out, although this summertime Sunday was much more tame. The train is parked clear of the station in order for guests to freely roam around, but with 20 minutes until departure, the two F units are nudged forward for boarding. This morning's engineer had posed the engines perfectly alongside the Elkins Depot, just feet from the end of what used to be the Western Maryland's route into Cumberland. As boarding only lasts 20 minutes, I split from the station pretty quickly, setting up behind the West Virginia Railroad Museum to witness the flyer reverse south for what is now the main line. With Mondays usually reserved for freight runs, Tuesdays and Wednesdays train maintenance, and Thursday through Sunday excursion days, the West Virginia Central is a 7-day-a-week show. Known around town simply as The Train, it's one of the Mountain State's biggest tourist attractions, regularly booked to capacity and providing great economic stimulus for Elkins. Its provision was strengthened today as an occasional railfan passes through in search of the WVC's historic F units. From the station spur, the flyer was to reverse onto the main line for the run to High Falls. This left me a few minutes to set up along the overgrown trackage as the two covered wagons began the 46-mile round trip into the mountains. If you have any interest in a productive chase of the flyer, you really have to capitalize in Elkins. Contrary from what the train's name suggests, track speed is pretty slow, allowing for some easy leapfrogs. I played it safe for the next shot though, as it was one of my most anticipated, backing up an old service road and trudging through the woods shortly after leaving Elkins. As the WVC is sparsely documented, I only had advice from the train crew on how to reach this spot, but I made it nonetheless to the coveted tunnel shot. Blasted through the mountain in 1899 by a WM predecessor, the tunnel was going to frame the train wonderfully as the F units stepped into the daylight. Although the West Virginian mountains are primarily known for coal, the WM was most interested in the region for its timber potential. CSX eventually absorbed it all before shuttering local freight business in 1997 when ownership was transferred to the state and operations to the DGVR. Stereotypical of logging railroads, these tracks come with impressively tight turns, dictating a maximum of 65 feet from coupler to coupler south of High Falls. Although we're well beyond the line's heyday, it is still neat to appreciate the past. Eclectic railroads far off the beaten path are my favorites to visit, and I knew I'd made the right call today as the 1952 built WM replicas continued their trip for High Falls. Just after exiting the tunnel, the WVC parallels Faulkner Road towards the edge of civilization at Bowden. It's quite an advantageous way to make the most of the remaining 4 miles of accessible track, especially when a few drive-bys can be thrown into the mix. Having nailed the tunnel shot, I was pretty much firing from the hip up until Bowden, just happy to be here as I was back in front of 243 less than a mile down the road. While most deadheads cover a relatively short distance, that of the new Tygart Flyer was nearly as long as the actual excursion. That meant my day was twice as bountiful, having started in Belington, and I was all over it. Although engine 243 still retains its steam generator, I was intrigued by the inclusion of a power car on the train's bottom end. Also capable of providing electrical power to the consist, I assume this generator car tags along to provide continuous supply when the engines detach for their runaround move near High Falls. Squeezing one more run-by out of Faulkner Road, the old WM branch line is preparing to enter the Monongahela National Forest, where the gradient nears an impressive 3%. Meandering away from Bowden, the WVC becomes extremely isolated as it enters the Monongahela National Forest. The railroad will remain nearly inaccessible for the rest of the run into High Falls, save a single shot in the holler of Bemis. Accessing the remote community requires a lengthy drive through the valley, during which I confirmed that mile for mile, I think West Virginia is one of the prettiest states I've visited. Half an hour from Bowden, and I was nearing my destination, unsure if I'd beaten the train, but enjoying the drive nonetheless. There is but one shot in Bemis as the tracks briefly emerge from the mountainside, passing perhaps the most remote train station one can find. The residents have even conducted their own census here at the station, although I can confidently say I'm probably the first visitor to lay eyes on their handiwork. My time in Bemis was quicker than I imagined it would be, as the low drone of 32 cylinders was soon echoing through the valley. The West Virginia Central has been paralleling the Shaver's Fork since the tunnel outside of Elkins, and will continue to do so into High Falls, where the waterway becomes the Cheat River. With the mountainous backdrops and Shaver's Fork framing the Western Maryland duo, I was so glad to have extended my chase into Bemis. Sometimes when railfanning, there are places I know I'll never return to. Although remote, Bemis is not one of them, nor is the rest of the West Virginia Central. The Mountain State had been good to me this morning, providing some great railfanning through very serene countryside. I know not when I'll return, but it is inevitable, as this whole operation is just way too good to not revisit. Thanks for railfanning with me today, and thank you to the kind folks at the WVC for such a fun morning in West Virginia.